This is module number 1 video for Theology 325 online at Creighton University. In this week, we're talking about the first phase in church history. And so the first 6 modules deal with church history, and it's kind of an abbreviated version of church history, just so you know. I will try to keep my comments somewhat brief, but realize there is a PowerPoint to follow along, and as you're reading, you should take notes, so I won't go into great detail here. But as you're taking notes or doing the reading, add in whatever you need to the slides. And then you'll take a quiz at the end of each module. So study both the notes you take over my video and the notes that you take over the reading. Okay, so in the first phase of church history, we're looking at the time of Jesus and a little bit before the time of Jesus and setting kind of the stage. So a lot of this deals with the Bible, especially the New Testament. But it is important to have a foundation of the Old Testament, and so briefly, the story of the Hebrew people or the Jewish people began in the book of Genesis with the story of Abraham, and the stories that are found in Genesis are either myth or legend. A myth is kind of a creative way of explaining how things came to be, and legend is usually a mix of fact and fiction, and we're not sure which is fact and which is fiction. But tells the story of Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people, and his descendants, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. And so Abraham is this great example to us of faith, and God promised to make of him great nations, which he did eventually, not immediately. He had one son with his concubine named Hagar. The son's name was Ishmael. Once he had a son with his wife Sarah, Ishmael and Hagar left, and Ishmael became the founding father of the Islamic religion. So Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all trace their roots back to Abraham. Abraham had a son named Isaac. Isaac had 2 sons, Esau and Jacob, who were twins. Esau was born first. Eventually, Jacob kind of steals the birthright from Esau, and he becomes the patriarch. And then he had 12 sons and 1 daughter. And of his 12 sons, the first son born to his beloved wife, Rachel, was named Joseph, although he was only his 11th son. Okay, so a little bit about Jacob, just quickly. There's a story in the Old Testament where Jacob wrestles with someone in the middle of the night. He's not really sure who he's wrestling with. And in the morning light, he realizes it's the angel of the Lord. And so through the angel, God tells him to change his name to Israel. The word Israel means to wrestle with God, and this explains how we have the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob and Israel are the same person. And of course, his favorite son was Joseph. Also, in the Old Testament, we learn about Moses, who was the deliverer. He was a Hebrew person who kind of lived a very easy life, being raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. And then eventually, he becomes the savior of the Jewish people who've been enslaved for 400 years. The slavery, the Jewish people ended up in Egypt at the end of Genesis when the brothers go see Joseph. And 400 years later, they're enslaved at this point in time, and Moses is the one that frees them from their slavery. That happens after 10 plagues are inflicted on the people, the last plague being the death of the firstborn. And to spare the Jewish people, God told them to kill a lamb and put the lamb's blood over their doorpost, and that he would then pass over their houses. And this is where we get the ancient tradition of Passover. Also, you'll read a little bit about David, who in the eyes of the Jewish people is the greatest king. He was great because he was a great military leader. He was great because he, under his rule, they had a lot of power and affluence and wealth. But he was also great because he was one of the least expected. He was like the 8th son of Jesse, so not even the first oldest or second oldest, which were primarily the most important people. And he's important to them too because when he sinned greatly by having a relationship with a married woman named Bathsheba, when he's confronted about that by the court prophet Nathan, he falls on the ground and humbles himself before God and begs for forgiveness. And so they see him as great also because he was humble and showed humility. Judaism itself, rooted in those stories, was an ancient religion and still a modern religion today, very important religion. It's important for lots of reasons, but the most important one is that Jesus himself was Jewish, and so all of their traditions were sacred to him as well. And anyway, Judaism was pretty unique in that time because they were one of the first religions to be monotheistic, meaning they believed in one God. They were unique because they saw their God, Yahweh, the only God, as also being intimately involved in their lives and loving them. And so many of the gods at the time, the imaginary gods, they saw as vindictive and vengeful. This God was a loving God, and he chose them as his chosen people. And they were also very adaptable. They had to keep moving and keep adapting to different leadership. And there were, in the grand scheme of history, very little time where they actually had total power and control over themselves. And so they also managed to survive and persevere during these times. The Romans, of course, had an influence on the Jewish people and on the Bible. The Romans were the people in charge at the time of Jesus. And they kind of were invited in to help the Romans at a certain time when they were trying to fend off the Greeks. And they helped the Romans fight off their invaders, and then they turned around and took over the land. And so that's kind of important. They kind of betrayed the Jewish people, and then they became the rulers, and they were the rulers at the time of Jesus. And this was kind of the peak of the Roman Empire, the first from the time of Jesus through maybe 300 AD. And it was really a good time for the Romans because of several things, one of which was Pax Romana, or Roman peace. So there wasn't a lot of invaders trying to come in and take over land. Also, they had a really pretty detailed road system, so traveling was pretty easy. They also had a pretty organized port system, so you could pretty easily know what time ships were leaving and coming in to port, and so that just made travel very easy. And of course, travel being easy allowed Christianity to spread. And of course, the Jewish faith was very influential because Jesus himself was Jewish, and a lot of our traditions, Christian traditions, have a Jewish foundation. The two big practices were the synagogue service that happened on the Sabbath and also the Passover meal. If you look at a Catholic Christian Mass, the liturgy of the word, or the first half, is roughly based off the synagogue service, and the second half, the liturgy of the Eucharist, is based off the Passover meal. Also, the first Christians were all Jewish people. They considered themselves members of the way, and they traveled all over to spread the word about Jesus. You can read about Jesus and his life and the life of the early apostles as they spread Christianity in the New Testament. Sorry, my light just went off. Let me get that to go back on. And anyway, there's some information in the notes about the New Testament, the books that are in the New Testament. And make sure you read about the different types of speeches Jesus gave and his different sayings and his different miracles. The 12 apostles were very important to the early church. They were the first believers. They were the first people to get to explain Jesus' teaching to a primarily Gentile world, and you can thank them for the spread of Christianity. Two people in particular are Peter and Paul. Peter was the head of the church, the first known leader. It's believed that Jesus wanted him to be the leader. Jesus called him the rock and said, upon you I will build my church. And then Paul was an important person who at first totally rejected Christianity and then had a total conversion experience and traveled all over the Mediterranean Sea, or to all the ends of the earth, as he said, to tell them about Christianity. It wasn't easy for early Christians. One thing in particular happened. It was called the Council of Jerusalem. Your book doesn't talk very much about it, but at the Council of Jerusalem, they were trying to decide if a Gentile person, needed to become Jewish first if they were going to be Christian. And they decided they didn't need to do that. And this was kind of the beginning of the end of the connection between Christianity and Judaism. The early Christians were heavily persecuted, starting with Nero all the way up to Constantine. And when Constantine became the emperor in 313 AD, he and the emperor in the eastern part of the Roman Empire named Licinius, they together published the Edict of Milan, which allowed Christianity to be practiced publicly and really ended the Christian persecution. So there's some real good and bad things that came from that. Primarily, the bad thing was that Constantine saw himself as the head of the church. Also, there were some problems with different heresies. So a heresy is a false teaching, And there were problems with people who denounced their faith during the persecutions to save their lives, but then wanted back into the church. And you'll read about those in this chapter. I think that's all I'll say about the first section, and I will talk to you again in Module 2.